super weird culty stuff, which I thoroughly enjoyed. Like, how likely are you to come across another person who also likes eating people? He has some cult leader energy. He has a cult leader aura. What is up, everyone? Welcome back, or welcome if you are new here. Today is the February wrap-up video. Very exciting. I did have 2 audio that I will talk about, so there are 2 more than these 5, but let's jump right into it. First was the DNF, and I feel really bad. This was a book club pick, and it was The Vanished Birds by Simon Jimenez. This has been on my list pretty much since it came out in 2020. You know, the blurb makes it sound like it's gonna be a really epic kind of sweeping fantasy. The narrative structure of it just, I couldn't with it. From the first chapter, it starts out with a character named Kada who lives, you know, on this fantasy planet. He does basically like farm work, like manual labor, and they farm these like seeds. It reminded me a little bit of Dune, actually, on Arrakis, like with spice on Arrakis. It kind of had that feel to it. So all of chapter 1 is basically Kada's entire story. I'm gonna kind of ruin chapter 1 just because it's only the first chapter. He falls in love with a beautiful ship captain named Nia, who goes off-world for, I can't remember what she does, some sort of trading or something like that between planets maybe. They fall in love every 15 years that she comes back to his planet, so that's kind of where like the time dilation and stuff comes in. Basically, we get an entire life story in just the first chapter. Like, chapter 1 could serve as like a standalone short story. Was excellent, excellently written. It was amazing. And then every subsequent chapter, 2, 3, 4, 5, we get all these new characters. And then I kind of slowly but surely realized, oh, we're not going back to Kada because we've already seen his whole story. And so I watched an interview with the author to try to piece together my feelings about everything. And essentially he said he is really excited by the idea of stories that set you up to think, you know, this is our hero and we're going this way, and then they kind of pivot and do something else. For me as a reader, that actually makes me feel like the author kind of pulled the rug out from underneath me. So I ended up DNFing at 33%. I was about 6 chapters in when I realized, like, oh, we're not going back there, because I just wanted to go back to Kada's world, and that's not what I got. The prose is wonderful. Like, he's a spectacular writer. There's like a sort of a musical element to his prose, so I'm very impressed. It just, there's something about that narrative structure that I couldn't continue, because it just felt like we were getting further and further and further away from any kind of plot having to do with Kada. So that was unfortunate. So one of the greats was for my Reading Around the World challenge for Ecuador. This is Jawbone by Monica Ojeda. I think I'm saying her name right, not totally sure. This is basically what Mean Girls would have looked like if it had been like a cosmic horror novel, like Lovecraftian style. It was very interesting. So we're following 4 or 5 different girls. The main 2 are Fernanda and Annalise, and they are kind of the ringleaders of a group of 15-year-old girls at this all-girls like bilingual Catholic school. And from chapter 1, we know that Fernanda has done something because she wakes up tied to a chair in her teacher's basement. So it's told in alternating point of views between Fernanda and the teacher, Clara. So Clara is the teacher. She's recently gotten a job at the girls' school, and anxiety rules her life. She is like a chronic overthinker. She has this very strange obsession with trying to look and act exactly like her recently deceased mother. So there's like some sort of unhealed trauma there. So Fernanda finds an abandoned warehouse in the city that they live in. I don't think it's ever stated exactly where they live. And the girls will like play around in this warehouse after school. It's got a couple of different floors, this completely just like empty, unfurnished building. And they start like daring each other to do crazy things that sometimes hurt themselves. And Annalise is kind of the first one to take things really far, and she invents this entity called the White God. About halfway in is when things are really starting to get weird. That is when we get this sort of like you know, exorcist possession sort of vibe, culty vibes start to happen. Annalise is writing, like, she dubs one of the rooms the White Room, where they worship the white god, and she makes these like commandments that the girls have to live by, and they're always very weird. You have to enter the room on all fours, or you have to sweep the floor with your hair after one of their ceremonies, like super weird culty stuff, which I thoroughly enjoyed. I will say the prose style is a little bit verbose, which I guess is kind of reflective of Lovecraft, which is maybe what made me think of that. So spliced into the main narrative are transcriptions from Fernanda's therapy sessions, which I thought was kind of interesting. So we get this like deeper layer of like psychology. Kind of feels like maybe there are times where she's lying to her therapist or getting caught in a lie, and so you do kind of start to question whether or not she is even a reliable narrator at all. So the main kind of theme in here was like puberty and bodily changes and kind of burgeoning desire, but then also how that can kind of quickly turn to obsession and violence. It almost feels like a female Fight Club. I will go as far as to say that. And normally I wouldn't compare something to Fight Club because I've read books before that do that, and they're nothing like Fight Club, but this one actually, there's something about the girls' obsession with doing these strange dares that it does kind of give that vibe. It's also kind of a rumination on like the horrors of puberty. There's lots about like the female body and discovering your sexuality, but again, how all of that relates to violence. The only negative for me was like the dialogue isn't separated by like dropping down to a new line. So it's tricky sometimes to know who is speaking. I feel like it was done intentionally though, because we can't really tell like which girl is speaking. And so they kind of all feel like this big blob, like maybe they're all the same person. So I think it was maybe done intentionally. It was published in 2017. So there are some pop culture references in here that already feel a little bit dated. But that was not a reason for me at all to drop it down from the great category. My favorite quote was, "In adolescence, what's most beautiful and most horrible comes to the surface. The same way that within the color white, there can exist both purity and putrefaction." I feel like that is a good quote to summarize this book. Highly recommend. Highly, highly, highly recommend. Next up was one I was not totally sure about in the beginning. This was the non-fiction of the month, and that was Becoming Supernatural by Dr. Joe Dispenza. I've heard mixed reviews on this one for sure. This is actually like very science-based spirituality, but ultimately it is a book about like the power of the mind, manifestation, visualization, etc. So if that sounds like your cup of tea, you will like this one. I will say if you've ever read any kind of like body, mind, spirit book with, you know, similar concepts like the Law of Attraction books, this is going to pretty much be what you've heard already. And so the subtitle is How Common People Are Doing the Uncommon. So Dr. Dispenza's whole thing that basically you are more powerful than you think you are in terms of being able to manifest whatever life you want or heal yourself of, you know, trauma or an ailment. I did really resonate with this idea that our thoughts can create, like, literally they create electrical signals in our brain. Those signals create the emotions that we feel in our body, which is why trauma hangs around. And so he basically describes like how we continue to recreate the past because we're never really fully living in the present moment. And the present moment is the key to unlocking the power of our conscious and subconscious mind. There are meditations at the end of every chapter, so it is very much like him trying to help you kind of practically, you know, helping you put these things into practice. Some of them I would say are probably more a little bit, I feel like they're quite advanced, I'd want to say. Like some of them have to do with isolating different muscles, like your pelvic floor versus your lower abs versus your upper abs, and pushing spinal fluid up to your pineal gland, and some things that are very out there and a little bit too abstract for me to actually do. I feel like I would need to start with a much easier, just kind of like body scan meditation. Some of the claims he makes have footnotes. There's a whole index in the back. Some of them don't. So it's just kind of like, take some things with a grain of salt, I guess. I've never come out of a meditation and felt worse. So I know what he's saying is like good. And if nothing else, I've taken away the fact that I do need to get back into my meditations because they do make me feel better. So that was Becoming Supernatural. Now we're getting into the good. So these are books that I still recommend. They just didn't like really knock my socks off. So the first one in this category is a fun one, and this is Youth Juice by E.K. Sathu. Not totally sure how to say her last name. As soon as I saw this in the bookstore, there was one left on the feature table, and I snatched it up because I am very into all of these like body horror meets the beauty industry or the skincare industry or the wellness industry type book. It's like my new jam. So this is like American Psycho meets The Devil Wears Prada, and also The Neon Demon. I just love these books so much because they kind of show like the crack in the false veneer of what the beauty and skincare industry is trying to sell us. So our main girl is Sophia, and she gets a job at Hebe, who is the Greek goddess of youth, I believe. It's this like Goop-esque skincare brand. And even though she is like very insecure, she has this really horrible nail biting habit, so she has to wear gloves all the time. And she's kind of awkward in her interview because we open with her interview. The CEO takes a shine to her. The CEO, you know, oh, there's potential there. I see potential in you. And so she hires Sophia on as the new, I think, like story director or something like that. So she works kind of with the marketing team. And Sophia gets exclusive access to Youth Juice, which is this yet to be launched new moisturizer that the brand is about to, you know, stock shelves with. And wouldn't you know, it has some interesting effects and side effects. One of the side effects, even though this cream seems like a wonder cream, is she starts having these very violent urges, like these violent images of like hurting people. And again, that's kind of where the American Psycho comes into it. We basically slowly descend into the very disturbing underbelly of Hebe and the ingredients that they're using in their products that are, you know, predictably disturbing. You obviously, from the cover, you can, you know, assume a lot. They do give away with this a lot with this cover. Again, we sort of have an unreliable narrator, possibly. That was kind of the vibe I was picking up about halfway through. It always just makes things more fun because you're like, can I actually trust you? Can I actually trust what you're saying? I do think it's important that it touches on the fact that like physical beauty, we put like so much self-worth and value on physical beauty in the current society that we live in. And Sophia is like the archetype of that. Lots about like female friendship, toxic friendship, toxic relationships, and then the intersection between beauty, but also like violence and jealousy and obsession. I will say, and the reason why this was not great, because it would have been, about half of this book consists of flashbacks to the year 2008. And we're supposed to assume obviously something, you know, happened in 2008 that Sophia keeps going back to. And so a good chunk of this book takes place in flashback. And we're watching Sophia with a high school friend named Mona just experience life together, fall in love for the first time, deal with mean girl bullies, etc. But I didn't see any point to it. I honestly don't know why it's there, other than to give us a little bit of insight, I guess, into Sophia's past. But there are 14-day actual present-day chapters and 10 flashback chapters. So almost an even split, like almost half the book. And I feel like it added like nothing. Those chapters felt like a waste of my time. Truly, I feel like you could skip those chapters and it wouldn't actually change your reading or understanding of the text. Somebody help me out there. I don't know. Otherwise, I loved it. This was an audiobook that I listened to on Spotify for my Reading Around the World challenge for Honduras, and this was The Mosquito Coast by Paul Theroux. Not exactly what I was expecting, which is why it fell into the good category. So we have Ali Fox. He is the father of the family that we're following. He's an inventor. He has some cult leader energy. He has a cult leader aura, and he is in search of utopia. So he believes that like he's the last real man. He denounces consumerism and literally takes his entire family on a boat to Honduras. They have no idea where they're going. Like, he doesn't tell them anything and they fully trust him. But it's understood that he's a genius. And so they're going to be able to get by and make it just fine because of his fabulous wit. So Charlie, his son, is actually our main character. So we're seeing the story through Charlie's eyes. And he has, you know, these horrible feelings of doom that something bad might happen because they're obviously in a very precarious living situation. He starts to resent his father because the kids aren't in school. Like, they're not going to school. It's very much like survival time. The mother is sort of like your stereotypical trad wife who doesn't really question anything her husband is doing, but seems to have like a genuinely positive kind of gung-ho outlook on this new environment. Really the only kind of compelling element of the plot was like waiting for Charlie's fears to be proven correct. Because you're like, well, yeah, something's gonna go wrong because this is very odd. It's really a story about like family dynamics. We don't even get to Honduras until like the first third of the book, which so it's got a little bit of a slow start. It's very character driven. Like, it's not a plot driven book at all. So I feel like if you read this book like it's a character study, then you will enjoy it. Because we understand early on that Allie is like the family's messiah. I mean, they really do treat him like that. He is the linchpin holding everything together. They would probably all die without him, without his genius. I think the most interesting aspect of the whole narrative is that watching his wife and kids slowly catch on to the fact that he while he's a genius, he's also insane. Like, he tells them lies about how America is on fire, but then the next sentence out of his mouth is, oh, everything's underwater. So they kind of start to realize, like, okay, things aren't matching up. You're lying to us. What's going on? Why are we here? You're just watching Allie come apart at the seams, basically. And then there's obviously the aftermath of all of that. It does get a little bit graphic in the end, so beware of that. Maybe check your trigger warnings. But if you like stories where you watch a character just like slowly descend into madness, then you'll probably like this one. Another Just Okay was actually a recent release. It came out this month on February 4th, and it was the author's debut. So for a debut, I can give it a little bit of leeway. It's sort of Tender as the Flesh meets Hansel and Gretel with like changeling folktale vibes. So it sounds right up my alley. I love all of those things. So we have Mama and Margot, who I think is supposed to be upper elementary, preteen kind of age. We're not totally sure. They live in a cottage in the woods. And they invite strays, so people who are wandering through the woods, to come into their cottage, just to rest their weary feet. But we quickly find out that Mama and Margot, they really like people. They really like them. They're actually cannibals. They like them so much. So if you don't want to read about eating body parts, stay away from this one. It will gross you out. But it was very bingeable. The audiobook was only like 8 hours long, I think. It's not particularly plot heavy, but the chapters were super short. They'd be like 5 minutes, and then you'd move on to the next one. Their routine is kind of switched up because a stray comes along named Eden, who is like Mama and Margot, so they choose not to eat Eden, and she actually becomes part of their routine. And then Margot has to deal with the fact that Mama's attention is going somewhere else, and Margot's bed is given up for Eden, and Margot is sort of shoved off to sleep on the couch. So Margot starts to have kind of I don't know if I'd call it a full coming of age story, but she has to grow up really fast to kind of deal with all of a sudden not feeling like the center of Mama's universe. And then because Eden is like them, it kind of begged the question, and this is where I kind of started having a few little problems with it, was, well, how common is it to be a cannibal in this world? Like, how likely are you to come across another person who also likes eating people? Like, I thought that was a little bit unbelievable. And then there are revelations that come out regarding like things with like different interpersonal relationships and Margot's father. I don't want to spoil too much, but Mama and Eden don't seem to have the best of intentions with Margot. And so, yes, we see things kind of unravel pretty quickly. The ending was very fast. It was a little bit too fast for me. I think actually now that I'm talking about it, it's kind of supposed to be reflective of the way that a lot of like fairy tales and folk tales are written. We introduce the characters and we have some sort of problem or tension, and then all of a sudden, the ending is wrapped up very nicely and neatly. And so that's definitely what happened in this book. So I feel like as a contemporary reader, I don't love that. I like things maybe a little bit more gray and a little bit kind of open to interpretation, and this was very finite. The overall message was unclear. Is cannibalism supposed to be used as a metaphor for unrequited desire or our secret desires, the way that we devour ourselves or other people with no regard for other people? I don't know. I just don't know. There were also some undertones regarding, again, puberty, like with Jawbone, and maybe some of Mama's suppressed sexual appetites, but it's like not really fully explored, you know? So it's like there was a lot of groundwork laid that maybe could have been truncated a little bit, and then we could have had more time to explore those things, and we just didn't explore them very deeply. I'm not gonna say it was boring, like it wasn't boring by any means, but it was a little bit underwhelming, because you get to the end and you're like, okay, but like why? What? You know? I could tell early on it was going to be one of those books where there's not a lot of plot. It's a little bit more slice of life. In this case, literal slices of humans. Ultimately, it left me with a lot of unanswered questions, and just this general like haziness as to what I was supposed to take away from it. So we do spend about 90% of the book just like watching their day-to-day activities. And then, like I said, the end wraps up very quickly. So I think it was intended as like a coming of rage story. You see that term used a lot nowadays. It's becoming very popular. And I would say that is what it was, but I don't know. It was mostly just like grotesque and vibey, which, you know, there's nothing wrong with that. I like grotesque and vibey. The next one, oh my goodness, this was a challenge. This was another book club book. I'm a part of a book club that definitely has more of like a literary lean to it. And so this one it totally made sense that this would be sort of assigned to us or chosen. This is The Dead Wander in the Desert by Roland Sasanbayev. I'm probably butchering that. This is for also Kazakhstan for my Reading Around the World challenge. So honestly, that's the only reason why I pushed through. It's nearly 500 pages, and the narrative style of this one, we really struggled with it. I think most of us struggled with it. It tells the story of basically the suffering of the Kazakh people under Soviet rule. That's kind of like a general overview. From the epilogue, it tells us, this novel is about how Russians from the north reached the nomads. They brought scientific knowledge, the stability of settled life, and written literature instead of folklore. It led the Kazakhs to the brink of spiritual death and the environmental disaster of the Aral Sea. So it's described as this existentialist folk epic, which is accurate for sure. I think I was expecting, you know, more of a typical narrative, kind of like Western storytelling. So that was my first kind of mistake. And I was expecting it to have really sweeping, beautiful language, and it does not. There were every now and then, like maybe once a chapter, there would be one line of description about like the moonlight on the water or something that would be really arresting. But other than that, there was really not a lot of beautiful, arresting language in this, unfortunately. It's very like stories nested within stories. Like somebody on our Discord chat for book club said it's like Russian dolls. So it's like you think we're reading about this story, and then another character will come along and we dive into them, and then another one, and then another one, and so then you're so far away from where you thought you were going, again, kind of like with Banished Birds. So not my favorite narrative framework to follow. We do have a main character, Kakarman. He is our main character, and we do have this sort of overarching storyline that if the Aral Sea dies, then the fishermen and the farmers who rely on it also are going to die, and then these ancient villages will crumble. So we do have this sense of urgency, and it's like a climate change book. It feels, you know, very important. It's like an important book, probably particularly in Kazakhstan. I don't know if it was just the translation from the original language. I think it was written in Russian to English. There was just something there, maybe just lost in translation. Kakarman makes it his mission to basically try to save the sea. He decides to try to travel as far as he can in the world to share this message about how the sea is drying up. Unfortunately, there were just too many characters to really follow or care about. There had to have been at least like 50 characters in this, if not more. But because of the way that the storyline is like this big like patchwork quilt, you can't really follow any of them very clearly. So I felt like I couldn't really cultivate any emotional depth with any of the characters because we weren't getting enough page time with them for me to really care about them. It feels like we're kind of just like, you know, when you're walking through a big crowd and you're just kind of like bumping through people, that's kind of what it felt like. It does take on a pretty nihilistic view of the world as well. It's kind of like humanity bad, you know, human bad, like any positive change that we try to make in the world is just kind of like a shout into the void. And yeah, we should do it anyway, but like just know that man's greed is probably gonna win in the end. It's very much kind of like nature versus industrialization. That's kind of the overall sort of feeling that I kind of left with. So I hate to say it's just an okay book, because I can see if it had been written maybe in a different style, how really epic and enjoyable it could have been, but for me, it was just okay. And then the last book, and this was another just okay book for my Reading Around the World challenge. This one was for Suriname. This is Orinoco by Afra Ben. So this was the first fictional account of slavery by a white European woman. It later became kind of an abolitionist text, but at the time, historians believe it wasn't really written for that, like kind of from that perspective. They believe that it was compelling at the time to people, not because the author chose to write about the horrors of slavery, but for how egregious it would have been for a prince, because that's who our main character is, to have been removed from his high station as prince down to slave. Later in the 1800s is when it was kind of reworked and turned into a more abolitionist, anti-slavery text. This takes place in the fictional country of Coromantien. So in the introduction, we're told that Ben's account of like cultural practices and stuff at the time weren't particularly accurate. So we're kind of told, without being told in so many words, to take everything with a grain of salt, because we don't really truly know if it's a true history. Her self-insert as one of the narrators is, questionable at best. So we're following the titular character, Orinoco, who is a prince. He's the grandson of an African king, and he's basically tricked and traded as a slave, sold into slavery, and has a love affair with a beautiful young woman named Imawinda, and then he attempts to lead a slave revolt. So that's the entirety of the plot, essentially. And then the narration goes kind of back and forth between her observations of the country and Orinoco's actual story. So this was written in 1688, the late, 17th century. It reads like it, right? Like the prose is, it's a bit of a struggle for sure. And it's also so short, like just because it's literally a short story, it's a novella, I think. Because it's so short, a lot of it, and I feel like a lot of shorter fiction falls into this trap, it feels a little bit like you're reading summary at times instead of actually watching a story unfold in front of you, because she's trying to get through so much in a relatively short span of time. And then because we get these moments of the narrator's life kind of interspliced with Orinoco's actual story, like her observations and things, it felt a little bit fractured. It kind of took away from his story and kind of what I thought the main plot was gonna be. So I kind of didn't love that she was self-inserting so often. Did I enjoy the overall reading process? Not all the time. Could it easily be argued that this is an important piece of 17th century literature? Absolutely. It shows its age. There are lines that are very icky. There are things that are very uncomfortable, like describing the prince as handsome in every way, if not for his skin color. Or there's even a pretty disturbing, after the fact account of SA. So it's not comfortable all the time. A few essays in the beginning and the end that help you contextualize what's actually going on at the time. And so this edition is probably the one that I would recommend. It has an introduction, and then it has some essays and stuff in the back just to give you a little bit of backstory. It very much reminds me of a book that I would have read at university. So it's a tricky one. It's a tricky one to have a strong opinion on. That was Orinoco. That was it. That was everything, I think. So yes, thank you guys so much for watching. Let me know what you read in February. I will see you in my next video. Bye guys.